for joining us. We were just holding off for a couple of minutes to allow more people to join us, but we'll get started now. So thank you for coming along. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping. It makes a change from us having to tell everybody where the toilets are and things like that, but we're doing some virtual housekeeping. So if I could ask you to keep your cameras and microphones turned off during the talks, please. And please be aware that this talk is being recorded. So we will be recording tonight's talks and then subsequently sharing them on our website. If you've got any questions following the talks tonight, then please do feel free to contact us. We can be contacted on Twitter, Facebook, or through archives@highlifehighland.com. And a reminder that we are part of High Life Highland and we're a charity. And if you're in a position and would like to donate towards our work, then there's a link to be able to do that. And we can certainly share that afterwards as well if people would like to. So tonight we are marking the 275th anniversary of the Battle of Culloden. In order to do that, we are going to look a little bit at the story of the Jacobite risings and the context that the Battle of Culloden came into. As I have said previously, no battle ever stands in isolation. They're part of a longer picture. And so in order to talk about Culloden, we need to cover that longer picture. My name is Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. I'm going to do an overview very briefly, 2 or 3 slides, just to talk about what archives are, where the Highland Archive Service is and what we do. And then I'm going to do an overview of the early Jacobite risings before handing over to my colleague Anne Fraser, who is our family historian. And she'll talk on the impact that those risings have had on 3 particular families. And then I'll resume after that to round off with how that story concluded at the Battle of Culloden. So to start off with, for those of you who are not familiar with the term archives, archives are original records of official bodies, companies, societies, and individuals. They can be of any age, so we have archives within our collections that are several centuries old, and also some that were created in the last few days. They can be of any extent. We have archive collections that are 1 document, and some that are hundreds of boxes of documents. And also predominantly what we hold is paper and parchment, but we also hold a range of other formats, including digital files, videos, sound recordings, and so on. The main thing about archives is that they're identified as being worthy of permanent preservation. They're irreplaceable and they form a unique record of our past. And the documents that Anne and I will use to tell these stories will prove this. They'll prove that what we're using are documents that are original, that are irreplaceable, and that because those documents have survived, we are able to tell these stories. The Highland Archive Service covers a very large geographical area. The area of the Highlands of Scotland covers about 1/3 of the landmass of Scotland. And so in order to be able to best serve that community, we have 4 archive centres across the Highlands. Our mission is to preserve, conserve and make accessible these archive collections for the whole of the Highlands. And so we do that through allowing access to people through our search rooms, but also through events like this where we're sharing the collections that we look after with people who are interested in finding out about them. We cover about 700 years of Highland history. Our earliest document is from 1299, but obviously we won't be going quite that far tonight. We have a dedicated family history centre with 1-to-1 consultation service, which you will learn a little bit more about at the end. We have a specialist conservation studio, so we can repair the documents that we look after. And we run a wide range of programmes of events and exhibitions and talks such as this throughout the year. We also run and develop Ambala, the digital archive, from within our service. These are our 4 offices: the Highland Archive Centre, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archive Centre, and the Skye and Lochaber Archive Centre in Portree, and Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William. And together these 4 lovely buildings make up the Highland Archive Service. They each have their own discrete area. So the one on the top left there, the Highland Archive Centre, looks after the records that are Highland-wide, but also for the historic counties of Inverness, Ross and Cromarty, Sutherland and Nairnshire. On the top right, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives houses the historic records for the county of Caithness, but it will also gradually house all of the nuclear records for Great Britain. On the bottom right-hand side, the Skye and Lochaber Archive Centre holds records that are discrete to Skye and Lochaber. And on the bottom left, Lochaber Archive Centre, which houses records discrete to Lochaber. All of us hold records produced by the Highland Council and the predecessors of the Highland Council, but we also all hold privately deposited collections of families, businesses, estates, clubs, all sorts of different things, and it's predominantly those that we'll be drawing from tonight. And before I come into my section of the talk, the two particular collections I would like to highlight that I'll be referencing are both from our Lochaber Archives Centre. So I'll be using items from the Cameron of Lochiel collection and also from the West Highland Museum Papers collection. West Highland Museum hold their own object collections, and we look after their documentary collections for them. And so I'll be drawing on both of those collections, particularly tonight, as well as a range of others. Across all of our archive centres, we're very fortunate to have public search rooms and temperature-controlled strong rooms. And as a service, we offer a wide range of events and activities for people. So I mentioned that we do one-to-one consultations with our family history staff. These include remote and digital consultations, talks, events, displays, tours, group visits. Obviously, over the last few years, we're in person, but just recently have been digital. School events and summer activities, archive and family history classes, both in person and online, and digital access to our collections through things like blogs, exhibitions, talks, events such as this. So that's a little very brief overview of the archive service. But now on to the subject that we're here to talk about tonight. So as I mentioned, I'm going to do a run through of the background to the Jacobite risings, how the battle that happened 275 years ago, about 6 or 7 miles from where I'm sitting right now, how did that come about? What's the context of that? It all starts, there are many places it could all be said to start. Almost everything can start with Henry VIII, but we're going to start with King James VII and II, and that's him on the left-hand side. His title comes from the fact that he was King James VII of Scotland and King James II of England, because the two numbers coming after the union of the crowns. So in 1660, James had married his first wife, Anne Hyde, and Anne was a Protestant, and they had had 2 children, Mary and Anne, and both of those children had been raised as Protestants. In 1673, he moved on to his second wife after the loss of his first wife, his second wife, Mary of Modena, who was a Catholic. And at some point around about this time, James converted to Catholicism. And we have to remember that this falls in the context of generations and generations of political turmoil and religious turmoil and conflict. James himself was actually relatively sympathetic to other religions, and I'll touch on that in the next image, but it was still a controversial decision for him to convert faiths, and it wasn't widely publicised at the time. But in 1685, he ascended to the Scottish and English thrones to become King James VII of Scotland and King James II of England. And this is a letter from 1686, just after he had acceded to the throne. And it's written by Louis Lamate. The letter is written in French, but the translation reads, "I have no doubt that you know the restless nature of my countrymen, particularly when they have an opportunity to cover their quarrels with the specious pretext of religion. The prince who has now ascended to the throne is active, zealous, enterprising, and bold in his enterprises. And because he has constantly suffered for his religion, he has convinced the world of his sincerity and his interest for the Catholic religion. One of the 3 kingdoms which are submitted to him is almost entirely Catholic. Our country is less large and fertile, but there are a great number of bold men who are attached to their opinions more than I can say when they are convinced of anything." I mentioned that James and his wife had had 2 daughters who were both raised as Protestant, but following his second marriage to Mary of Modena, James and his wife Mary, his second wife, gave birth to a son, James. This knocked the line of succession, which meant that the new son would be the next in line to the throne. He became the new heir presumptive, and he would be raised as a Catholic. And there were some within the establishment who became worried about what that would mean. There had been traditionally a tradition of Catholic monarchs believing in the divine right of God. And as I say, James was not stringent necessarily on that. He was quite sympathetic to other religions. But there was some unease within the establishment about this new Catholic heir. And so what happened next was termed the Glorious Revolution, a slightly uncomfortable piece of terminology. This was what was termed the invited invasion of James's daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. And they were invited, in quotes, by a certain select group of Parliament to come from Holland and to seize the throne, which they did. And so James VII and II fled to France, where he was recognised as the rightful king, and William and Mary were crowned as joint monarchs. This is an image from within our collections that shows James II and VII receiving the news that William of Orange has landed and that he was going to have to flee. And you can just get a sense of all the intrigue there, of all the whispering and rumours. And you can see on the right-hand side the newborn baby who had been the catalyst for all this panic and unease. So immediately after the Glorious Revolution, we entered a period of turmoil. So in May 1689, after the coronation of William and Mary, the Jacobite risings began right across the British Isles. The term Jacobite coming from James, supporters of James, from the Latin Jacob, the Latin for James. This wasn't a Scotland-England divide, but it was a religious, political, and progressively a cultural divide. There was a lot here about political reform, about how to best run Parliament, and of course about who should hold the power. It's interesting, there's not a very clear Scotland-England divide. As I say, there were risings in Ireland, in England, but there is seen to be a divide between the Highlanders. There are some things at this rising and later on that only apply to Highlanders. John Graham of Claverhouse, who was the first Viscount Dundee, commonly known as Bonnie Dundee, he led the support for the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland, and this caused concern for those who supported William and Mary. And you can see at the bottom there an entry from the Inverness Borough Town Council minutes from 1689. And it reads, "The council having met for regulating the affairs of the borough, taking to their consideration the great fears this place is exposed to through the incursions of the Highlanders who are threatening to fall on the lowlands." And that's one of the things I was referring to, that reference to the Highlanders as something other, even though this is written in the heart of the Highlands. It's very much seen as a cultural difference. So July 1689, the Jacobites won the Battle of Killiecrankie, but their leader, Bonnie Dundee, was killed. And he had been a very capable and strategic military leader. And command of James's forces in Scotland passed to first Alexander Cannon and then Colonel Thomas Buchan. And you can see here two examples, both from the West Highland Museum papers. The left one written by Alexander Cannon, the right written by Thomas Buchan, both requesting for troops to be raised. But from August 1689 through to May 1690, it was clear that the cause had been weakened by the loss of Bonnie Dundee, and so the Jacobites went on to lose battles at Dunkeld and Cromdale, and gradually the rising dissolved. The next big rising was the 1715, but there are a couple of key points that we need to just touch on before we come to the 15, just to get the wider picture. So a couple of things. 1690s, Scotland lost a vast amount of money. They had invested money in a scheme trying to establish a trading colony in Darien, but the scheme had collapsed and Scotland had been left with huge debts. In 1701, James VII and II died in France, and the cause of the Jacobite claim to the throne was passed to his son James, who became known as the Old Pretender, and that's James on the left-hand side. In 1701, the Act of Settlement was passed, which enshrined in law that the throne of the United Kingdom, as it was to become, couldn't be passed to a Catholic. So instead of now being a sort of gradual uneasiness between the two sides, it became enshrined in law that it wouldn't happen. In 1694 and 1702, Mary and William, respectively, died, and the throne passed to Mary's sister Anne. So you'll maybe remember I was saying at the beginning, James had those two daughters. So the throne passed from Mary to Anne. And in 1707, the union of the parliaments of Scotland and England, which was of concern to some in Scotland, partially because of that great loss I talked about, the Darien scheme. So there was a feeling by some of those involved that it might be an uneven partnership. In 1714, Queen Anne fell ill, and immediately the word spread up the country, and the establishment very quickly became concerned that another rising would occur. And so on August the 16th, 1714, the Nairn Borough Town Council minutes read, "The Provost and Council having met, the Provost presented a letter from the Lords of Justiciary and Exchequer, directed to the magistrates of this borough, bearing that the Queen was taken ill, and requiring the magistrates of the boroughs in their respective bounds should look to the keeping peace and prevent any disturbance within their precinct." So there's already an awareness that something might happen. And in 1714, Queen Anne did indeed die, with leaving no heirs. And so the throne passed to George the Elector of Hanover, who became King George I, reigniting the Jacobite cause. It's sometimes helpful to see this in kind of diagrammatic form. So you can see there Charles I on the left-hand side, and his son James VII and II, who was the James we started with. The Old Pretender coming down, and then instead of the throne passing down to James the Old Pretender, you can see it went to Mary and William of Orange, then it went to Anne. Instead of going to James, you can see that they travelled all the way back and across and down to George I on the right-hand side, because he was the nearest Protestant relative who could take the throne, having passed in 1701 Act of Settlement, meaning that no Catholic could take the throne. Immediately on George's accession to the throne, this address was written by 102 chiefs and heads of clans in the Highlands, written to King George I and organised by John Erskine, who was the Earl of Mar. It seems doubtful that this address ever made its way to King George I, but certainly what did happen was that Mar was not given a role in office in government, which is what he had been angling for. And so he switched sides and turned to lead the Scottish support for the exiled King James instead. Mar, as I say, took command of the Jacobite forces in Scotland. We have several documents within our collections. This example is from the Cameron of Lochiel collection, calling for supporters to take up arms. And he says in this one, "Our rightful and natural king, King James VIII." So King James, who would have been the 8th and 3rd, never got that title, but he was commonly known by the Jacobites as King James VIII and 3rd. And so he's saying that he's coming to relieve us. King James VIII is coming to relieve us by grace of God from our repression. And so he's entrusted me with the direction of his affairs and command of his forces in this kingdom. And so you now all need to gather your support, gather arms, gather people, and come out in support of the king. And so he raised the Jacobite standard at Braemar on the 6th of September, 1715. And this is another contemporary letter from that moment from the Lochiel collection. This was written to John Cameron of Lochiel from Mar, and it reads, "John, Earl of Mar, Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's forces in Scotland. These are in His Majesty's name ordering and requiring you forthwith to raise all your men, friends and following with their best arms and accoutrements, and to march them immediately to Argyllshire to join the king. Other forces and friends there who are to march from there towards Glasgow." The 1715 had a lot of support. The potential for the 15 Rising to succeed was very strong, but a lot of time was lost in minor battles and skirmishes and unsuccessful attempts to take targets such as Edinburgh Castle. All this time, the Hanoverian army, of course named after the House of Hanover, or the government army, were preparing for battle. And so on around about the 13th of November, battles were fought in the 1715 Rising in Preston, which was a very clear and decisive government victory. In Sheriff Muir, this battle was inconclusive, but what it did achieve was stopping the Jacobites from advancing any further. And in the Highlands, things were starting to come to a head as well. Families were coming out on both sides of the cause. Opposing groups were travelling all across the Highlands, going to meet their respective leaders to join them to join those armies, and were clashing when they met. And Inverness had been taken over by a Jacobite garrison led by William Macintosh, younger of Borlam, and Sir John Mackenzie of Coole. For now, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand over to Anne, our family historian, and she is going to take up the story there to look at how the 1715 Rising, the impact that it had on 3 Highland families.
Okay, thank you, Lorna. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, and hope you can see that. Okay, so my title is 1715 Highland Family Connections. And this study of the 1715, in particular the siege of Inverness, led to the discovery of the many connections between all the various families involved, regardless of their allegiance, Jacobite or Hanoverian. I'm going to concentrate on 3 of the leading lights in this part of the 1715 story. They were all real people leading real lives, and through one of the very many difficult times in our history. Really, you can look at it as they were your ancestors. And I don't want them to be just names. I mean, who were they? What family did they have? What was their involvement and who did they support? What were the consequences of their choices? And we're going to finish with some amazing family connections. So Lorna has set the scene for us. By the time of the 1715 uprising, the Highlands were totally split, and following the raising of James Standard at Braemar by the Earl of Mar, both sides are springing into action. But first, let's take a wee step backwards. I investigated 3 families in particular who played an important role in the 1715 uprising. 2 on the Jacobite side, so we have Macintosh of Borlam and Mackenzie of Seaforth, and 1 on the Hanoverian side, Rose of Culrock. Now, from these 3 families, we will look at particular people, we'll look at their background, and obviously their part in the 15. We see their proximity to Inverness and to each other. So we have Borlam Castle, which was 4 miles south of Inverness. We have Bran Castle, which was 16 miles northwest of Inverness, and Culrock Castle, which is 12 miles east of Inverness. So we're going to begin with the Macintoshes of Borlam. Now, this Borlam is situated in Scanaport on the southeast side of the River Ness, within the parish of Dores. There are actually 3 Borlams round Loch Ness itself, one at Drumnadrochit and one down near Fort Augustus, but this is the one in Scanaport. Borlam has actually been the home of my family for well over 100 years, and it's where I grew up, and my brother is still a farmer there, hence my interest in this family. It's recorded as a castle in many old maps and was burnt down by the Hanoverians sometime before Culloden, and this is the house which eventually replaced it. Many people over the years had tried to find the exact location of the castle, but in the early 1970s, we actually had a visit from a well-known historian and author, Nigel Tranter, who was keen to check for the foundations of our house to see if they related to the castle. And my mother took him down to the cellars and the dungeon, and his words were, and I'll quote him, "But can't you see it? These are the foundations of the castle." The Macintosh of Borlam also had a couple of other properties, this time in the Badenoch area. So they had Bencar in the parish of Kingusie and Rates, which was subsequently called Ballaville in the parish of Alvey. You may have seen Ballaville House when driving up or down the A9. It wasn't this grand house at the time the Macintoshes of Borlam stayed there though. They subsequently sold Ballaville Estate to James Macpherson, the translator of the Ossianic poetry, who had this house built to a design by Robert Adam. But in particular today, I'm looking at Brigadier William Macintosh of Borlam, who made the first big impact in the 1715 from a Highland point of view. He was known as the Brigadier, or quite simply, Borlam. And many people were known by their geographical home or estate. I'm actually still called Anne Borlam by many people today. But if it wasn't for the 1715 uprising, perhaps we'd never have heard of the Brigadier, as we'll refer to him today. Tonight, we're going to look briefly at what's known of his life prior to the 15 and his role in the uprising. The Brigadier was born in 1658, the eldest of at least 8 children, his parents being William Macintosh III of Borlam and his wife Mary Baillie. Now, this Mary Baillie was the daughter of William Baillie of Dunane, which was situated just across the river Ness from Borlam, and his wife Elizabeth Forbes, who in turn was the daughter of Duncan Forbes of Culloden. And this made the Brigadier a second cousin of the Duncan Forbes of Culloden, who as Lord Advocate and Lord President of the Court of Session worked as tirelessly for the Hanoverian side as the Brigadier did for the Jacobite cause. The Brigadier was educated at King's College, Aberdeen, where he obtained a Master of Arts in July 1677. And the Reverend Lachlan Shaw described him as a gentleman of polite education and good knowledge. He followed a military career, most probably fighting in the French army, and by 1681 he had actually become a captain. He married Mary Read from Oxford in 1688. Now, she had been a maid of honour to Princess Anne, later Queen Anne, who, of course, as Lorna has mentioned, the youngest daughter of James VII with his first wife. We can gather from letters that actually have passed between Queen Anne and Mary that they had known each other as young children. Mary's grand aunt, Mrs. Anne Winwood, a staunch supporter of the Whigs political party, was not happy about the match, and she worried about how infatuated Mary was with her husband. Mrs. Winwood wrote in her will that she, and I quote, could not persuade her against having him, and she ensured that Mary's legacy could not be touched by the Brigadier in any way. Mind you, the Brigadier and his wife still named one of their daughters Winwood after Mary's grand aunt. You don't meet many Winwoods these days. The Brigadier left Britain around 1688 to join the exiled King James and was with him in Ireland when the first Jacobite rising of 1689 failed. In 1700, the Brigadier moved his wife and children north to Scotland, and in particular to Rates, now called Ballaville, as I mentioned, near Kingussie, and they settled there for a number of years. They obviously also spent much time at Borlam, as letters from Mary survive, and one to her brother written in 1703 is headed Borlam, 8th of June, 1703. In that letter, she's asking for news of her relatives and friends, but it is mainly taken up with asking about the legacy from her father, which had not yet been paid to her. The following year, in 1704, the Brigadier was appointed as Commissioner of Supply for Inverness. Now, these commissioners were the local administrative bodies, which from 1667 to 1930 in Scotland, they were originally established to, in each sheriffdom, to collect tax. Later, they took much more responsibility for the local government of Scottish counties. But this miniature, which belonged to Mary's family, portrays the Brigadier in an open-breasted scarlet coat with a blue lapel collar and gold button mounts, and on his head a low three-cornered hat with a plume, a dress stated by a competent authority to be the uniform of a foreign regiment in the pay of France in the early 18th century, which was actually very similar to the Duke of Berwick's regiment. This miniature was probably painted in France around 1707 when William was first styled as Colonel, and would have been sent to his wife when she was staying at her family home in Ipsden between 1707 and 1708. During 1710, Their daughter Winwood married Roderick Mackenzie of Fairburn, another Jacobite. But sadly, 2 years later, in 1712, the Brigadier's wife Mary died at the very young age of 44. A new uprising was being planned, and the Brigadier, following the death of his wife, was involved with the preparation, throwing himself into more Jacobite activity. We can see evidence of this in a letter of 24th September 1714, written to the Duke of Montrose by the Master of Sinclair, which reads, Mr. William Macintosh, he was called Younger because his father, William of Borlam, was still alive until 1716. He is traversing the country from west to east and has prevailed on the Laird of Macintosh to join the Pretender's cause. Momentum was building. Prior to his adventures in the 1715, a passion for landscaping and rural management found the Brigadier planting trees at both Borlam and at Ballaville. And you can see from this photo of Borlam that he planted trees along the edges of each field to help provide shelter. I mean, these are only just some of the fields you're seeing, but there are lots. They're mainly oak, beech, ash, and sycamore trees. We found in a letter to his brother Lachlan in 1711 that he's asking him to send a bag of ash and sycamore seeds. The statistical count covering the parish of Alvey mentions Ballaville, and I quote, it says the lawn in front of the house is adorned with upwards of 100 large trees of hardwood and a fine row of elms along the old military road, planted by Brigadier Macintosh in 1715. He found, quite a time to do quite a lot in 1715. He was 57 years old. He was certainly not thinking about a retirement. And in January 1715, William of Borlam Sr. made over land to his grandson, the Brigadier's son, bypassing the Brigadier, probably to avoid forfeiture in the event of an unsuccessful uprising. His father must have foreseen what may be going to occur. On the 11th of September 1715, we know the Brigadier was in Inverness that day, as he was one of the witnesses at the baptism of yet another William Macintosh, son of a merchant, Angus Macintosh. And I'll just read this one to you, where it says, Angus Macintosh, senior merchant in Inverness. And you'll notice a blank here, and that quite often happens in an old parish register, that the session clerk doesn't know what Angus's wife's name is, has left it blank to fill it in later, and hasn't gone back to it. But she is a Macintosh as well. Oops, that's gone too far. She's his spouse had a child born and baptised by Mr. Robert Bailey, called William. And we see here Mr. William Macintosh, Younger of Borlam, William McBain of Kinnahail, William Macintosh, Treasurer of Inverness, and William McPhail, Merchant, Younger, and Wit. So they are the witnesses at this baptism. 2 days later, on the 13th of September 1715, the Brigadier and the Macintosh chief marched into Inverness, proclaiming James as king and kick-starting the rising in Inverness. While in Inverness, they also intercepted a commission which was to give control of the town to Monroe of Fowles, and they established a Jacobite garrison. They went to Culloden House looking for weapons, but Lady Forbes would not let them in, as her husband, the Brigadier's second cousin, was not at home. Interesting as well, it was the Macintoshes who sold Culloden House to the Forbes many, many years before. Also on the 13th of September, we read in the Inverness Presbytery minutes where it says, the Presbytery did approve of the moderator's conduct, notwithstanding it was with great difficulty the brethren could leave their own houses, considering to what an height the rebellion is now come. Mr. Bailey reported that he was detained a prisoner in his own house by 4 sentinels of the Macintoshes while they were proclaiming the Pretender. Remember, the established church were against the Jacobite risings. Well, some of them were not. The Brigadier then left Inverness and marched south to join the Earl of Mar. His role in Inverness's story ends here. But the acts he was to become famous for were still to come. The brigadier took part in the disastrous Battle of Preston, reluctantly leading his regiment under the Earl of Mar's orders across the border in what he knew was a badly planned military operation. Now, this copy of Borlam's signature is from a letter sent from Kelso on the 23rd of October 1715 on his way south. Interestingly, John Preble thought Brigadier Macintosh of Borlam should have led the 1715 uprising instead of the Earl of Mar. Despite his military expertise and his misgivings, he obeyed Mar's orders. The Jacobite army was forced to surrender at Preston, and the brigadier was captured and held prisoner in London's Newgate prison. He escaped on the night before his trial and stayed in exile until he could take part in the brief and unsuccessful 1719 uprising. The brigadier was seen as a Jacobite hero, and ballads were written, one such entitled An Excellent New Song on Rebellion, which starts, Macintosh was a soldier brave, and did most gallantly behave, when into Northumberland he came, with gallant men of his own name. It continues. Old Macintosh, he shook his head when he saw his Highland lads lie dead, and he wept, not for the loss of those, but for the success of their proud foes. The Macintosh, and to Wills he came, saying, I have been a soldier in my time, and ere a Scot of mine shall yield, will all lie dead upon the field. A price appeared on the brigadier's head of £1,000 with this description. A tall, raw-boned man, about 60 years of age, fair-complexioned, beetle-browed, grey-eyed, speaks broad Scotch. And the poem continues. But Macintosh and his friends are fled, and they'll set the hat on another head, and whether they are gone beyond the sea, or if they abide in this country, though our king would give £10,000, old Macintosh will scorn to be found. There is also a bagpipe tune, or a pibroch, called Macintosh of Borlam's Salute, that was written in honour of Brigadier William Macintosh. Now, following the 1719 rising, the brigadier was captured again. This time he was held securely in Edinburgh. During this, his final imprisonment, he maintained an interest in rural management and wrote several pamphlets and essays on the agricultural management, urging the establishment of a national agricultural college. The brigadier eventually died at the age of 81 years in prison in Edinburgh, 2 years before the Jacobite uprising of 1745. Now, I'm going to take a slight break, and I'm going to ask my husband, John, whose first language is Gaelic, to come and read part of this Gaelic poem, which was a song to William of Borlam by a woman who was actually his nurse and was written before August 1716. And even if you do not understand Gaelic, it's good to hear the language of your Highland ancestors. Okay, John, can I just move that over? Are you okay there?
Warrant William of Borlam. Sterk and you, Machushkaya, when Kai Alapin Kustri, from the Hennes Navage, the Nafaction is G, took fame to Cross Tara, Horsnen Garston Kuchid, and when Purgat at Hashin, Murkavu Farash rear she. Chayan circle Kupakust, seeking Atchachuan, fecht a high on the Jeepru, Chaile need in a bone. Han hwrach yn ptisial y dolsias mar a mawl, ag fydd chwgsio na riach cwyn an diwsyn a fawn. A haid Shaw Lawrence yn Jimshaw, van ha ni bwrstwyd trawn, chwgsio ha bot yn y binne, gwte nisyn lawn. Styniad y losgig yn bibl, chwyd a nid yn a bawn, hwy fydd hasyn yn stichbl, yn dwy yn rhy chwyd loing. Bydd y gwrni le dichil, Diachortian in Luing, fechtje een boost in de Giebrug, dus een stiepel uit lauw, han de tuslach het jide, on share meer roen de heil, ik look moest in de viering, smoor a lyric shibuur. Mocht jech, Ulam Borlam, wie ik dersen na huur, een ver misnegal, moordoog, alleen een goud in de koe, bij een hien unach jeepel, creatielus kun loop, ze verhalen goed dieply, en du kan jeetjus gach boe. Zo die goelig na versten, het jul die een rechtsom aan goorst, hij gach doeg als een gachi, wel is schecher aan boer, mag kan doosig na brachtig, is klan gachten na boer. Ik gaf volkeren onachteren, schap aan de maskelu naar roer. Goed hij meent in collega, het je maar gedig zou gaan, en vecht je een deel naar une, kun over eines naar huur, voor een bijke nog tjeten, en dan edit toch hoest. Vian naar Spanje ga eeuwig, slaantje hemisch a groen.
Tapelad a grain. Thank you so much, John. That was good. I didn't make him read out all 16 verses. So it's interesting there's only one verse actually dedicated to William of Borlam there. The author appears to be concerned as much for the state of the country and especially of the Macintosh clan as for the individual members. I read a quote that said it was not simply a song of sorrow and anxiety, it is a song of anger, filled with a feeling of betrayal by the Marquis of Huntly in particular and the rulers of the country in general. The Brigadier is remembered on a wall plaque within Greyfriars Cemetery within Inverness, where it says, "To the memory of Brigadier William Macintosh of Borlam, son of William, son of Lachlan, son of William, son of Lachlan More Macintosh, 16th Captain of Clan Hatton, throughout a long life and unto death, the constant adherent of the Royal House of Stuart." You know, for those family historians among us, wouldn't it be great if all gravestones gave son of, son of, son of, son of? It would save us a lot of time. So staying with the Jacobites, we're moving from the Macintoshes to the Mackenzies, and in particular the Mackenzies of Seaforth, who were also central to the uprising in the Highlands. The Bran estate, held by the Mackenzies of Seaforth, is situated 16 miles northwest of Inverness and 3.5 miles from Dingwall. And the castle was built in the 1600s and demolished in the 1950s. Its stones were used for the foundations of the new Conan Bridge. We will be focusing on William Macintosh, the 5th Earl of Seaforth. Who was he? What can we find out about him? So William was the only son of Kenneth Mackenzie, 4th Earl of Seaforth, and his wife, Lady Frances Herbert. William's father, Kenneth, the 4th Earl, was the son of Kenneth, the 3rd Earl of Seaforth, by his wife, Isabel Mackenzie of Cromarty. And I'm telling you this because this Isabel and her daughter-in-law, Frances, William's mother, did not get on at all. In fact, the feud between them was so great that the Seaforth estates were nearly sold in 1712. But Isabel died in February 1715. William was known among the Highlanders as William Dhu, or Black William. And a wee bit of political background here. His father, Kenneth Mackenzie, had been made a member of the Privy Council by James on his ascension to the throne, so that's James VII or II, and was amongst those, along with the Brigadier, who then accompanied James to France in 1689. James had created him Marquis of Seaforth, but it was all too late. Kenneth spent time in prison, both in Inverness Castle and Edinburgh Castle, and when released, he lived the remainder of his life in exile, dying in Paris in 1701. William, understandably on account of his father's time in France, spent much of his earlier life abroad, but in 1713, a letter from his mother headed Leith, January the 22nd, to Colin Mackenzie of Kincraig states, and I quote, I find my son William is fully inclined to do justice to all. Within 15 days, he'll be at Bran. Signed, Francis Seaforth. Well, William married fairly early on in life to a Mary Kennett, and they had at least 3 sons and 1 daughter. But William's mother was not very happy about this union, but Mary soon won her over, especially with their united front against William being involved in the 1715 uprising. It's written about William that he was a willful boy, full of courage, devoted to his clansmen, and ardently desirous of an opportunity of leading them against the foe. We also understand that William was a dear friend of the Brigadier. The Earl of Mar invited Seaforth, along with other principal Jacobites, to a supposed grand hunting match at Braemar on the 27th of August 1715. The intention, of course, was to raise the standard there. Most of the Jacobites were well aware of this intention, and as we know, on the 6th of September, the standard was raised at Braemar. 3 days later, the Earl of Seaforth summoned his men to a meeting in support of the Jacobites. His wife and mother felt the venture was unlikely to succeed, so tried to dissuade him, especially as Bran was partially surrounded by the Hanoverian Earl of Sutherland and Monroe of Fowles. Seaforth disregarded their advice, and he commanded his retainers to attend. 7 days later, they marched into Inverness. The Brigadier by this time had left to march south, and Seaforth had been tasked with replacing the garrison at Inverness Castle. He left his cousin, Sir John Mackenzie of Coole, in charge when he returned home to Bran. Now, by the end of September, Seaforth should have joined the Earl of Mar, his second cousin, by the way, but he was still in the north and time was slipping away. The Earl of Sutherland, who was joined by Mackays, by Rosses and Monroes, formed a line of loyalist supporters at Alness to prevent Seaforth and his men moving south. Seaforth, accompanied by MacDonald, Mackinnons and MacLeods, marched towards Sutherland's men, causing them to retreat. And despite this apparent victory, Seaforth still did not march south to join Mar. Instead, he indulged in petty standoffs and raids, gaining and losing ground throughout the Cromarty Firth area. It has been said that the apparent power went to his head. He and 3,000 to 4,000 men finally joined Mar around 2 months later. This delay likely contributed to the failure of the rising, as Mar waited for augmented forces before marching south to confront the Hanoverians. I'm going to read this part here of the Mackenzie genealogy manuscript here, which says, if the Earl and his mother's clans had advanced a month earlier, the Duke of Argyll could not have dared to make head against Mar's united force. As it was, Seaforth arrived late to join Sheriffmuir, and the army was split. Some going to England with the Brigadier, and as we've seen, and others staying in Scotland to confront the Duke of Argyll at Sheriffmuir. Seaforth did not cover himself in glory at Sheriffmuir, instead remaining out of danger with a mounted bodyguard of 40 men, eventually fleeing to France after the Rising collapse. So William's role in the 15 led to his estates being forfeited and the loss of the title Earl of Seaforth. In actual fact, the forfeiture hardly impacted him, as for many years his tenants refused to acknowledge it and continued to pay their rent to him overseas. Despite also taking part in the failed 1719 Rising, Seaforth was granted a pardon by George I in 1726. The forfeiture of the estate, however, was not reversed. William died in 1740 in January on the Isle of Lewis and is buried in Uig Chapel. He was succeeded by his son Kenneth, who was Lord Fortrose, who had changed sides and supported the government by the time of the 1745 uprising, resulting in the return of the title Earls of Seaforth. Just one example of how families supported either or both sides of the cause. And so to my final study on the opposing side, the Roses of Culrock. Culrock Castle is situated 12 miles east of Inverness. So a bit of background about Culrock Castle itself. I've got another one here. Yes, you can see better with this aerial view. In 1416, the tower was built that we can see there on the left, if my mouse would work, yeah, up here. And then by 1553, the mansion house itself was added. And then in the 1700s, we've got the main staircase. So that's the extension, the extension at the back here. And then corridors and also the west wing over to the right here. And the Queen Anne window was put, that's in the front, we can't see, was put in the drawing room. And the drawing room ceiling was heightened and most of the rooms had their stone walls plastered. Of all the three castles that I've mentioned today, this is the only one still standing. And we can see there another view from the other side. So looking at the people who were there, the Roses of Culrock who were there at the time, we see that the 14th Baron, Hugh Rose, it doesn't like when my mouse moves, is it? Hugh Rose, the 14th Baron, who married first Margaret Innes. Now she was the eldest daughter of Robert Innes of Innes and Jean Ross, who was the daughter of Lord James Ross by his wife Margaret, who was the daughter of Lord Buccleuch. I probably lost you now. And they had 7 children, but you can see that only the first 3 survived. And then he married secondly Mary Forbes, who was the daughter of Lord Alexander Forbes, in fact, and his wife Anne Forbes, who was the daughter of son John Forbes of Pitsligo. And they had 6 children. I'm going to look in particular at 2 of the sons, the eldest from his first marriage, so Hugh, who became the 15th Baron, and the 4th son from his second marriage, Arthur. So let's look at Hugh, the 15th Baron first. So he was actually one of 82 members of Parliament who voted against the Union of 1707. And this was due entirely to his belief that Scotland could be a successful independent country and not because of any loyalty to the deposed Stuart monarchs. In spite of his no vote, he was made one of the commissioners to represent Scotland in the first Parliament of Great Britain. Hugh Rose was so firm in his beliefs in Protestant succession that when the uprising broke out in 1715, even when neighbouring clans prepared to go join the Earl of Mar, he stood totally loyal to King George. He saw the new Hanoverian line as a chance for a parliamentary revolution, a shift of power from the monarch to the Parliament. He had a garrison established at Culrock Castle which dissuaded Jacobites from any attacks. He had many enemies, but particularly the Macintoshes. Many Hanoverian supporters thought the castle to be quite a sanctuary. The other member of the family I shall be looking at is his half-brother, Arthur Rose. Arthur was the 4th out of 6 sons to the second marriage, as I mentioned. His foolhardy and impatient nature was to be the catalyst which ended the rising in Inverness in 1715. Arthur was a merchant, and whether a good or a bad one, he managed to get himself caught by some pirates on a journey to the Levant and was kept prisoner in Algiers for some time. The British consul in Egypt eventually succeeded in buying him back from the pirates, but wouldn't let him go free without recouping their money through a ransom. So Arthur was still a prisoner, and for a number of years. It is known that his half-brother, the 15th Baron, did not have much money, but he ultimately came up with the ransom payment as his half-brother Arthur returned to Culrock in 1714. Now in August 1715, Arthur produced a scant testament dative and inventory for his brother George, a sailor who died abroad, And this is mainly concerning a loan made by their father to his sons, William, George, and Arthur. And I'm just putting this in to say, for those doing family history, don't not look at wills and inventories in Scotland's people, because quite often there might be something there for your family that you might not expect to be there. And so we reach the 12th of November, 1715. And I'm going to read the Inverness Borough Town Council minutes, which says, "We're incredibly informed that you, the magistrates, town council, and community of the Borough of Inverness, have collusively and deceitfully admitted into your castle a garrison of about 100 rebels, commanded by Sir John Mackenzie of Coole, who styles himself governor for the Pretender. Apprehend, arrest, and secure the person of the said Sir John Mackenzie and of the other rebels, denying him and them all aid and comfort and means of subsistence, until you either apprehend and secure him and them as above, or force and constrain him and them to relinquish and abandon your said castle, certifying you that if you admit to or fail in any article of the premises, we will look upon and demean you as aiders, assisters, maintainers, and comforters of rebellion, and as traitors and open enemies to our sovereign King George, and as such will annoy and prosecute you with fire and sword and the utmost vigour of war." Now, as we now know, the Highland Jacobites had mainly marched south, led by the Brigadier, Sir John Mackenzie of Coole, has been left as commander of the garrison guard in Inverness. Sir John was no less than the Baron of Culrock's son-in-law. That must have been a bit of a thorn in his flesh, because Sir John was married to Hugh Rose's daughter, Margaret. In order to try and remove the garrison, Culrock, Forbes of Culloden, and Simon Fraser of Lovat planned to blockade Inverness in an attempt to starve the rebels into surrender. Enter impatient and impulsive Arthur Rose, who had a quicker plan to seize those rebels holed up in the Inverness Tolbooth. There is much written of these events within articles such as the Sutherland Book, History of the Mackenzies, the Culrock Papers, and various letters. The letter on the screen was written by John Hossack on the 13th of November 1715 to the Laird of Achnagoern, and tells the story of what happened to Arthur. So I'm going to actually read that one. But Mr. Arthur Rose, who commanded his brother's men and was ordered to line the chapel yard and cover the prospects against a sally from the town, from a great deal of zeal and courage, neglecting his charge, ran fast to his fate, for he ran up the street. His people followed him and attacked the Tolbooth, having in this way been encouraged by seizing the captain of the guard, where in the entry he received the fatal ball that in 4 hours after gave a period to his life. His death is regretted by all honest men, as well as his friends. A further, more detailed account was given by Major James Fraser, which was corroborated by the Culrock Papers. And it reads, "Arthur Rose, brother to Culrock, a gentleman of a resolute and daring spirit, proposed to seize the garrison in the Tolbooth of the town by stratagem. For this end he chose a small party, numbering 12, of his brother's men, commanded by Robert Rose, son of Blackhills, and on the night of the 12th of November 1715 proceeded so far as to enter into the vestibule on the top of the lower stair. Here a fellow whom he had for his guide, and who been well known to the men in the garrison, promised to get the door opened. Called to them to open. They opened the door, and the villain entering, and Arthur Rose close after him with a drawn sword and pistol, he treacherously cried out, 'An enemy! An enemy!' Upon this the guard crowded to the door, shot Mr. Rose through the body with a pair of balls, and so squeezed and crushed his body betwixt the door and the stone wall that he could not have lived. And it says, although he had not received the shot. His own friends carried him off, and he died in a few hours in the house of Mrs. Thompson in Inverness. This fatal end of a brave and beloved brother provoked Culroch so much that he sent a message to the magistrates. But going back to Culroch, you can imagine his outrage when his brother was killed. He threatened to destroy Inverness if the garrison did not leave. John Mackenzie of Coole swore to Culroch, remember, his father-in-law, that he was sincerely grieved at what had happened and pled that he would be allowed with his men to leave Inverness safely. Culroch let Sir John and his men escape by boat from Inverness pier, and they crossed the Firth. Incidentally, the many variations of this surrender included one from Lord Lovat, Simon the Fox, 20 years after the event. And he was writing to the Earl of Ailey, calling Arthur's death a little skirmish and boasting that, and I quote, by my continual threats that I would put Sir John and all his rebellious garrison to the edge of the sword, and the poor cowardly governor ran off at night and his garrison and left the town at my discretion. He continues, I marched in and took possession of the town the next day with 800 grants and 400 Monroes. Shows you how you have to read all the excerpts that there are in history and see what are the common denominators. Anyway, Sir John went to join the Earl of Mar, and his estates were forfeited for his part in the uprising. So Culroch took charge of the Tolbooth and Inverness Castle and was joined by Frasers, Forbes and Grants. The siege of Inverness came to an end. The rising was effectively over. And all this was happening as Seaforth was at the Battle of Sheriffmuir and Borlam, the Brigadier, was at the Battle of Preston. The rising collapsed across the country at the same time, and the three Highlanders that I've been focusing on today were each present at the major events that day. Going forward in time, the Roses, although Hanoverian supporters, kept many of their opinions to themselves, thereby being able to entertain both sides. For example, in the days preceding the Battle of Culloden, both Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Duke of Cumberland were entertained by the family. And Culroch folklore suggests these boots, which are still in the castle, are supposed to have been worn by one of Cumberland's troopers. The Roses were not the only family to hedge their bets by the 45. The 1715 had taught that nailing your colours to the mast maybe wasn't so wise. To end the Culroch study on a light note, you have seen paintings today supposed to represent Arthur and Hugh Rose, and these were just two of the many paintings on Culroch Castle, and here's a few more. And you know, I was looking at the likeness, and I asked about these paintings some years ago, and firstly, they're not Raeburns. In fact, I was told in comparison to Raeburns, they're practically worthless. But seemingly an artist would arrive at castles and houses armed with pre-painted canvases with the faces missing, and he'd paint in faces a bit similar to those around at the time to portray their ancestors. You may see quite often the same sort of clothes being worn, or in a woman's painting throughout the Highlands in different castles and big houses, the same necklace being worn by different characters. So a number of years ago, following the study of all this, I drew up an extensive family tree, which shows that the three families we've focused on this evening are all related. And not just these three families, but various other families and individuals involved in the uprisings and smaller battles or skirmishes that were going on. Many of those surnames will be familiar to many of you. And I'm just going to conclude by relating a few of them that were all connected to each other by blood, and yet came against each other in these battles. So we of course have Camerons of Lochiel, who were involved in the fight for Jacobite restoration for several generations. The time of the 1715, we have John Cameron, who was the 18th, He was a son of Sir Ewan Cameron of Lochiel, a staunch Jacobite supporter. He had actually been knighted by King Charles II. And John Cameron led his clan into the battle at Sheriffmuir, and the reward for his loyalty to the Stuarts was being titled Lord Lochiel by the Old Pretender in 1717, and having his Loch Aber estates at risk of forfeiture by the Hanoverian government in the wake of the Rising. But this forfeiture did not happen on this occasion because John Cameron had transferred the legal ownership to his son. After the 1715 and a brief role in the ill-fated 1719 uprising, John Cameron spent the remainder of his life in exile, dying in Flanders in 1748. His son, by the way, Dr. Archibald Cameron, was the last Jacobite executed for high treason in 1753. Forbes of Culloden, of course, we've mentioned them already. Duncan Forbes, who was born in 1685. He was the second son, but he inherited the title on the death of his brother John, although both brothers were involved in the 1715 uprising and, of course, supporting the Hanoverian side. Duncan Forbes was actually married to Mary, daughter of Hugh Rose of Culrock, and niece of Arthur Rose. But also, she was the sister of Margaret Rose, who had married Sir John Mackenzie of Coole. Duncan, being a lawyer to trade, rose to become the Lord President of the Court of Session. A constant supporter of the Hanoverians, he nevertheless entreated both sides to act with caution in anticipation of the 1745 uprising and despaired at the cruel treatment of the Highlanders following the Battle of Culloden. We have Monroe of Fells. So Sir Robert Monroe of Fells, he was born in 1684, and he was the son of Sir Robert, the 5th Baronet, and Jean, who was actually the daughter of John Forbes of Culloden. So you can see the links coming in here. So he was a first cousin of Duncan Forbes, and of course also then a first cousin once removed of John Mackenzie of Coole, the governor of Inverness. Monroe's part in the 1715 uprising led to his appointment as a commissioner for the survey and disposal of forfeited estates following the Rising, a role that he occupied between 1716 and 1724. Sir Robert Monroe found military success late in life, leading his regiment to fame at the Battle of Fontenoy and finally dying before Culloden at the Battle of Falkirk, fighting the Jacobites during the 1745 uprising. And of course, we have Mackenzie of Coole in there, connected through the Roses of Culrock, the Forbes of Culloden, but also his father's brother-in-law was Alexander Baillie of Dinane, as well as Alexander Baillie of Dinane was the uncle to the Brigadier. We have Mackay's of Farr. Now they're connected on the tree through the Monroes of Fells, again Hanoverian. We have Chisholm of Chisholm on the tree because Alexander Chisholm was the great-grandfather of John Mackenzie of Coole. We have Baillie of Dinane that I mentioned already, first cousins of both Mackenzie of Coole and Macintosh of Borlam. And of course we do have Fraser of Lovett. Simon was born in 1688. And lots of information is known about him. And I think Lorna might be mentioning him, so I might just leave him just now. We have Macintosh of Macintosh as well, of course, and they're connected as well to the Camerons of Lochiel. And then we have the Earls of Athol. We've got the Campbells of Argyll, and they're connected to the Earls of Athol and to the Mackenzies. And we have Macpherson of Cluny. We have Macleans of Dochara, connected through the Macintoshes of Borlam. We've got the Macintosh of Borlam, the Macintosh of Seaforth, and of course the Rose of Culrock. But we also have many Inverness provosts, including Alexander Duff, who was the provost during the siege of Inverness. He leant towards the Jacobites, and his daughter Anne married Lachlan, Macintosh chief. And amazingly, related to them as well is John Erskine, the Earl of Mar, obviously one of the main instigators of the 1715 uprising. His great-grandparents were George Mackenzie of Seaforth and his wife, Barbara Forbes, daughter of Arthur, Lord Forbes. So these are just some of the names that appear to connect in with each other and included on the Highland Connection family tree that I've constructed. And finally, I would really just like to encourage anyone who lives in or is visiting the Highlands to arrange an appointment to come and visit the Highland Archive Centre when we reopen, to view the ever-growing Highland Connection family tree. So I am now going to hand back to Lorna to continue with the aftermath of the 1715 and beyond to Culloden. Thank you for listening. Stop sharing. Okay, Lorna, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. It should be just coming up in 2 seconds.
That's fine, Lorna, it's all there.
All there, perfect, thank you. Okay, so Anne has, as she always does, blown my mind with that level of working out of a family tree, which I find completely extraordinary skill. I'm going to finish by talking about what happened at the end of the 15, subsequent risings, and how we ended up at the battle that we're commemorating today. So as Anne mentioned, the death of Arthur Rose in the 1715 rising in Inverness brought about the end of the rising in the Highlands at the same date that the rising collapsed in Sheriffmuir in Preston. Really interesting, and Anne also said that, how interesting it is that it all kind of faded and collapsed on the same 2 or 3 days. There were some serious repercussions for the people involved in the Jacobite risings, including the forfeiture of estates and titles. The 1716 Disarming Act, which banned the carrying of weapons, but only in certain parts of Scotland. So you remember I said it wasn't a clear England-Scotland divide, but there is a feeling, even at this stage, that there's something about the structure and organisation of the families in the Highlands which makes it easy for a rising to happen. And so the Disarming Act targeted carrying of weapons in certain parts of Scotland. There was transportation, imprisonment and death for some of those who had been involved in the rising. And perhaps one of the most lasting legacies was the extensive construction of roads, forts and bridges across the Highlands. So these are the Wade roads and bridges, the forts at various locations across the Highlands, including Ruthven, built for the purpose of expediting troop movement, so that if the rising occurred, troops could be moved at speed across the Highlands, and then troops could be garrisoned there as well. So that's one of the lasting legacies in the landscape of the 1715 rising. But comparatively speaking, the repercussions of the 15 were not as strong as what we will come to see after the 45. The repercussions for the magistrates, who Anne mentioned, included the fact that they were all entirely replaced the following year. There was obviously a feeling that they couldn't be entirely trusted to prevent this happening again. And that they spent their time in what looks to us like a very modern thing to have to deal with. It was fending off claims of compensation for people in the town who had been frustrated at things that had been stolen or looted or damaged. You can see these examples here of claims for compensation from within our Inverness Borough papers. So the top example is from Hugh McGregor, a shoemaker in Inverness, and he's saying that he declares and complain, as I have in 2 petitions presented by me formally on this account, that I want 6 shillings sterling for shoes which Sir John Mackenzie of Coole and his men took from me against my will, of which 6 shilling I have had promise of payment sundry times, but no performance as yet. The bottom one talks, the top one is against Sir John Mackenzie of Coole stealing something. The bottom one has a claim against Sir John Mackenzie of Coole, who had stolen something, but also against the Earl of Sutherland, who had stolen a broadsword. So there is a feeling amongst some of these documents that they're not really leaning one side or the other. They just want their compensation for what's been taken from them in the middle of this turmoil. This document is one of the most powerful pieces that I think that I've come across. So this is from the Presbytery of Dornoch minutes. This is written in 1716. So this is the church court above the kirk session. And I think sometimes we can forget how heavily involved the kirk was at the established church in fighting against the Jacobite rebellions and standing against them. This extract is from 1716. And it says, the Presbytery of Dornoch, taking to their serious consideration the tokens of God's displeasure against this land, which are evident by the unnatural rebellion raised in it by a popish and Jacobite malignant faction in favour of a popish pretender in occasioning an intestine war, so a civil war, in this our native land, which has raged now for a considerable time, and yet continues the evil that it has produced, and still threatens to our holy religion and civil liberties, the probability of its leaving our land desolate and a field of blood, if not suppressed. It is a really powerful piece of writing. It concludes that the presbytery believes that this is a judicial stroke from God because of the abounding sins of the people. But it's such an interesting prophetic piece. This was written well after the 15 had ended, but looking ahead in an awareness that this is not over yet, and that sentence of there will be a probability that this war will leave our land desolate and a field of blood, I think is particularly powerful. The next rising that happened on the road to Culloden was the 1719 rising. You'll all be familiar, I'm sure, with Elandonnan Castle, but perhaps not in that state as we see it on the right-hand side. So the 1719 rising came about when King Philip V of Spain offered his help and assistance to the exiled King James VIII. He sent around 300 Spaniards across to, under George Keith, the Earl of Marischal, to land on the west coast of Scotland, with the aim of meeting with the Highlanders and distracting the Hanoverian government. There was a main invasion planned for the south of England, and this group of Spaniards were being sent to meet with local Jacobite supporters and cause a distraction. They landed in Stornoway and then moved across to Elandonnan Castle in Kintail. At that point, the Spaniards and the Highlanders together were discovered by government warships, and the castle was blown up. And that was how it ended up in the state that you see it there, and was only rebuilt to the building that we see in so many photographs of the Highlands today in the 1930s. Those Highland and Spanish troops dispersed, scattered away from that site of that explosion, and they met Major Whiteman's government forces in battle in the pass of Glenshiel on the 10th of June 1719, which is believed to be the last time that foreign troops fought on British soil. We come then, of course, to the 1745 rising. Now, there were, of course, other small events, small skirmishes, and any peace that existed was, of course, very uneasy, and in anything in this time period is not cut and dry like that. Any time, any peace will be uneasy given the context of the times. But the next big event that we come to is the 1745 rising. By this point, the Jacobite cause is being fronted by Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was the son of the would-be King James VIII and III and the grandson of King James VII and II. And he arrived in Scotland in 1745 and immediately went about setting up the royal standard at Glenfinnan. And this letter, written to Ewan Macpherson of Cluny, who I think was one of the many linked families that Anne referred to, was written by Prince Charles Edward Stuart. And it says, being fully persuaded of your loyalty and zeal of the King's service, I think fit to inform you that I am come into this country to assert his right at the head of such of his faithful subjects as will engage in his quarrel. I therefore intend to set up the royal standard at Glenfinnan on Monday the 19th instant. Your appearance on that occasion would be very useful, but if not practicable, I expect you to join me as soon as possible, and you shall always find me ready to give you marks of my friendship. And it's signed Charles PR, Charles Prince Regent. So still taking that title of being the Prince Regent to his father, the king if he had been so crowned. So from that raising of the standard in August 1745, in September 1745, the Jacobites started to march. They captured Edinburgh. They didn't capture the castle, but they captured Edinburgh and carried on south. And on the 21st of September 1745, they met the Hanoverian government troops at the Battle of, what was then called the Battle of Gladsmuir, and now tends to be called the Battle of Prestonpans. And that was the first major confrontation of the 45. It was a very distinct and clear Jacobite victory. And of course, that did a huge amount to boost the morale of the Jacobite forces on a winning streak, if you like. They then carried on their march south. An order from Bonnie Prince Charlie to his army in 1745 reads, "You are hereby authorised to repair forthwith to England, and there notify to my friends, and particularly those in the north and northwest, the wonderful success with which it has hitherto pleased God to favour my endeavours for their deliverance. Let them know it is my full intention in a few days to move towards them, and that they will be inexcusable before God and man if they do not do all in their power to assist and support me in such an undertaking." So both of those last two documents are really rallying call to get people on side, to get them up, speaking on behalf of his father and on behalf of the cause, and trying to encourage and fire up that spirit to come out in support. Interesting there, words that are used a lot, my endeavours for their deliverance. So there's a kind of portrayed as, I am doing this for you, this is your deliverance, that I'm acting on your behalf. And so I mentioned that they started to move south, and they crossed the border into England in November 1745, arriving in Derby in December 1745. They weren't that far from London by this point. Derby is not that far from London, relatively speaking. But what they had expected was, they had expected significant support to come out in the north of England on their route. And of course, some did, but not significant. And they were expecting reinforcements from France to come in support. And that also failed to materialise. And so they made the decision to turn back, and instead of heading on to London, which had been the plan, that they would head north again. It's often seen by a lot of historians as the key decision in what would happen next. There is, to some extent, no point at all in speculating what might have happened in other circumstances, but it's often seen as this was a key decision, the decision to turn back north. So on their route back north, they won the Battle of Falkirk in January 1746 and continued north to meet the Duke of Cumberland's army and stop him from taking the town of Inverness. The Battle of Culloden is where this all culminated. This is the culmination of the 45 and of this long story that we've seen from the 1680s onwards. The Jacobite army arrived exhausted. They were exhausted, and they knew that the Hanoverian army was not. And so rather than try and meet them face to face in battle, they attempted to snatch a victory. The Hanoverian army had arrived, they'd marched from Aberdeen, led by the Duke of Cumberland, who both Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Duke of Cumberland in their mid-20s at this point. And so the Duke of Cumberland had led his troops from Aberdeen, marched them over. It had been the Duke of Cumberland's birthday. He was the son of King George II, incidentally. It had been his birthday, and so he had rewarded his troops with extra rations, with some drinks, and they had camped at Nairn and had a well-rested, well-fed night. When the Jacobite army arrived, as I say, they were exhausted, and they thought that perhaps one way to snatch victory back would be to plan a night attack and march on an attack. And there's some argument scholarship that says that if they had succeeded in that, then they may well have won. But they were so exhausted that their progress was so slow on their attempted night attack that they didn't make it in time, and they had to turn back. And of course, all that the result of that was that the Hanoverian army were still in the same position as before, but the Jacobite army were now even more exhausted. There was quite a lot of debate about the site of the battle because, of course, with that night attack failed, it had to come to a face-to-face battle. And there was a lot of debate about the site where the battle would be. And in the end, it was believed to be Bonnie Prince Charlie who said that they would fight where they stood. It wasn't the worst location, it wasn't completely terrible, but it was not ideal for the Highland charge, which would be their preferred way of fighting. And of course, as I'm sure you will all know, the Battle of Culloden was an absolutely crushing defeat for the Jacobite forces. In battle history terms, an incredibly short battle. It lasted around about 1 hour. It's estimated that about 1,300 men were killed in that hour, with about over 1,000 of them being on the Jacobite side. It was the last battle on British soil and the end of the Jacobite risings. I wanted to touch on the aftermath of the battle because I think that's so key to why this battle is still looms so large in the imagination and in people's minds and hearts. I mentioned that after the 1715 there were repercussions, but they were not. They were severe, but they weren't, strenuously enforced and applied to everybody. This changed after the 45. Land, estate, and title forfeitures. Although, as Anne mentioned, by this point people had got a little bit wise to keeping a son on each side, a foot in each camp, but still there were land, estate, and title forfeitures. There was far more widespread persecution of Catholics, and we hold documents in our collections that talk about sent from Whitehall giving instruction to watch for the establishment of popish seminaries. There were numerous executions of Jacobite supporters, and one of those was Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, who Anne touched on. An interesting character would be an understatement, but he had come out in support of the government side in the 15, probably against his heart's desire, and then had come out strongly for the Jacobite cause in 1745. And he was one of those who was executed. And I wanted to read to you this extract from James Bradshaw, written in a speech by James Bradshaw, who was an English Jacobite. And this was made just prior to his execution after taking part in the battle. I mentioned that I think the Lorna Presbytery Minutes is a particularly powerful document. This is another one which will really have an effect on people, I think, to hear. After the Battle of Culloden, I had the misfortune to fall into the hands of the most ungenerous enemy that I believe ever assumed the name of a soldier. I mean the pretended Duke of Cumberland and those under his command, whose inhumanity exceeded anything I could have imagined in a country where the bare mention of God is allowed. I was put into one of the Scotch kirks together with a great number of wounded prisoners who were stripped naked and then left to die of their wounds. And the document goes on, but it does give some insight into how he became known as Butcher Cumberland. In addition to that, there was other repercussions which have had a very long-lasting effect. So, for instance, the removal of the culture and infrastructure which might enable another rising in the Highlands. So, as I said, after the 15, there was an understanding that while this wasn't a particularly Scottish cause, other than the affiliation to the Stuart monarchs, the structure and the family dynamics and the clan dynamics that existed in the Highlands made it very easy for this sort of rising to happen. And so one of the things that happened after Culloden was the attempt to completely dismantle this infrastructure. So there was an extension to the Disarming Act. The power of the clan chiefs was vastly reduced. Wearing of Highland dress was prohibited. And this document on the right-hand side that you can see is a warrant of commitment against Archibald Chisholm. So this is somebody being arrested. Archibald Chisholm was arrested for wearing Highland dress, what's described as a philibeg, a small kilt. And he was arrested for that and put into prison for 6 months. If he had been caught a second time, and I don't know if he ever was, but if he was caught a second time, then transportation would have been the punishment for a second time being caught. And this was incredibly effective because the Jacobite clan claim all but disappeared over the coming years. And so these pieces of legislation that were put in alongside the Wade roads, the building of the forts, had the effect that had been desired by those putting it in. I wanted to finish with this slide just to say that, as I say, there's been a lot of a lasting legacy, some of which has been romanticised, some of which has been later pulled on in poetry and song and all sorts of things. One thing which I think is particularly interesting to note as a lasting legacy of these conflicts is that the 1701 Act of Settlement, which I mentioned, it was amended in 2015. Allowing members of the royal family in line to the throne to marry Catholics, but it's never been repealed. And so it currently still remains impossible for the monarch of the United Kingdom and various other territories associated with the United Kingdom to be a Catholic. So as I say, there are all sorts of cultural legacies, political legacies, but also we still have legacies within our legislation in this country because of this period of conflict. Thank you so much for joining us. I really hope that it has been of interest to you, that you've enjoyed the talks. If you would like to know more about the Archive Service and our offices, then here are our Facebook and Twitter accounts if you'd like to follow us. At the bottom there, you can see Archives email address, which will come to any of the archive team, and genealogy email address on the bottom if you have any family history questions. If you've got any questions that have come out of these talks or you have any feedback for us, then please do get in touch. The final thing, just to point out, as Anne mentioned at the beginning, she runs family history classes, and our next series of family history classes are beginning on the 5th of May this year, so in a few weeks' time, Wednesdays and also on Fridays. So if you'd like to book onto those or find out more about them, then please do contact us. And if you want to join in with the talks that I do each Thursday on our Facebook page, then they go out live on Thursdays on all 4 of our Facebook pages, and you can catch up later on YouTube. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. I really hope you've enjoyed the evening, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.